Her knees were scraped raw again. The chill of the dirt floor bit into her skin as she tried to crawl backward, but there was nowhere to go. The pantry door slammed behind her, casting everything in shadow. Grace didn't scream this time. She knew better. Screaming made her stepmother angrier. "You'll stay in there till you learn not to cry over nothing." Margaret's voice snapped from outside. "No one wants a useless girl sitting around the house whining." Then it was quiet. Just Grace's shallow breathing and the creak of the wind outside. Born with one leg shorter than the other, her right foot turned sharply inward, making walking hard and painful. Her father used to carry her when the pain got too bad, lifting her like she was weightless and whispering that God had made her special, not broken. But he was gone now. 2 winters passed, dead from a bad fall off a roofing scaffold, and his voice had gone with him. Margaret, her stepmother, had never hidden her disgust. "That leg is the devil's mark," she hissed one day when Grace had dropped the water bucket trying to carry it in. "A real burden is what you are. Ain't no man gonna want you. And don't look at me like that. I didn't ask for you. Your daddy did." Grace used to believe if she just behaved, just stayed quiet and useful, things might change. But nothing changed. Her chores doubled, her food shrank, and the bruises grew harder to hide. Most of the townsfolk in Dry Creek didn't know. Or maybe they did, but it was easier not to ask. Some nights Grace lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the loose boards of the old house, imagining she could walk far, far away. Maybe to the next town. Maybe where no one would notice the way she limped. Maybe where people didn't raise their voices just to feel big. But reality was smaller than dreams. Her world was the fence-lined yard, the cold water pump, and Margaret's voice always spitting venom. She had no one now, not even the neighbors who used to smile politely when her father was alive. Since he died, they looked the other way. One afternoon, the beating came harder than usual. Margaret had been drinking, something stronger than the usual sour cider. And when she saw Grace hadn't swept the chicken coop, her rage boiled over. Grace tried to explain she couldn't make it that far without her crutch. Margaret had broken the last one, but the words didn't help. "You're nothing but trouble," Margaret growled, dragging her by the wrist and throwing her out into the yard. "You can sleep with the pigs tonight. See if they complain less than you." The mud soaked through her dress. Her lip bled where it had caught the edge of the porch step. She pulled herself to the barn and curled beside a pile of straw, clutching her arms around her ribs. She didn't cry. She didn't have the energy, just the soft ache of her leg and the quiet numbness that came after the pain. By morning, the frost had kissed the ground silver. Her dress clung to her like wet paper. She moved stiffly, her body sore, and tried to drag herself upright. That's when she heard the hoofs. A horse's slow trot, measured calm, not like the fast, angry gallop of riders who came into town looking for trouble. This was different. She froze when she saw the man step down from his saddle. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet stillness about him. He wore a dust-covered coat and a low hat that shadowed most of his face. But when he spotted her, this muddy, beaten girl crumpled in the barnyard. He stopped. Grace looked away, humiliated. She didn't want to be seen like this. Not by anyone, especially not someone clean and proud-looking like him. He didn't speak right away, just crouched down a few feet from her, letting the reins of his horse hang loose. "You all right?" His voice was low, careful. She blinked. Her throat hurt too much to speak. "You got family here?" he asked again. She shook her head, just slightly. He stood then, slowly, and looked toward the house. Margaret was nowhere in sight. The chimney didn't even smoke. Grace expected him to ride off, like everyone did. Just turn his horse and leave this mess alone. But he didn't. He took off his coat and walked back over to her. Gently, without touching her, he laid it beside her in the straw. "You cold. Use it," he said. Then he sat down beside her, knees bent, staring at the trees like he had nowhere else to be. The silence was strange. Not heavy, just calm. She finally whispered, "She says I'm cursed." He didn't flinch. Some folks say a lot of things when they don't want to feel guilty. She looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't young, maybe in his 30s. His face was hard, scar near his jaw, but his eyes were soft, tired, like someone who knew what it felt like to not be wanted. My name's Micah. She didn't say hers. He waited, not pushing. She whispered it eventually. Grace. He nodded once. That's a good name. For the first time in a long time, she felt something other than fear in her chest. She didn't trust it yet. Didn't trust him either. But something about the way he sat beside her in the cold, without expecting anything, made her think maybe, just maybe, this man was different. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Margaret didn't like it. She came out once, hands on her hips, scowling. You got no business hanging around here, mister. I was looking for work, Micah said flatly, not moving. There ain't none here. I'll ask the horses then, he muttered and walked off to the barn. Grace almost smiled. Margaret slammed the door behind her, muttering curses under her breath. But Grace watched from the edge of the house, half hidden behind the porch rail. Micah stayed a while that day, fixing a broken gate and talking to her between chores. He never asked about the bruises, never made her talk when she didn't want to. But he listened when she did. She learned he was a drifter, fought in the war, worked cattle, helped build a rail line once. Said he didn't like staying too long in one place. Why are you still here? She asked one afternoon as he whittled wood on the fence. He looked up at her. Someone ought to be. Grace blinked hard. Her throat tightened. She didn't say thank you. She didn't know how. But that night, when Margaret screamed for her, she stayed curled on the porch steps instead. And when Margaret came out swinging a wooden spoon, Micah stood between them. She didn't do nothing, he said firmly. Margaret laughed. And who are you? Her guardian angel. No, he said calmly. Just someone who ain't afraid of you. That changed things. Not overnight, but slowly. Margaret didn't hit Grace as much after that. Didn't like the way Micah looked at her. That quiet, unblinking stare that told her he saw everything. And for the first time since her father died, Grace started to feel the smallest flicker of safety. Not because Micah made promises. He didn't. But because he stayed. Just stayed. And sometimes that was enough. The first time Grace remembered laughing since her father died. It happened so quietly she almost missed it. Micah had come by late that afternoon, his arms full of firewood he claimed he'd traded a spare horseshoe for. He handed her a crooked chunk shaped like a dog's head, tilted it in his hand, and asked, "Think he looks mean enough to guard your door?" Grace stared at it a second, lips tight, and then something soft slipped out her chest. Half a chuckle, half a breath. It surprised her. Him too. He smiled real slow. That night, she kept the wooden dog next to her pillow, its splintered ear pressed against her cheek. Micah started fixing things around the house. Quietly, methodically. The front gate no longer sagged. The hen house had a new latch. When Margaret snarled at him that she hadn't asked for help, he tipped his hat and said, "Didn't do it for you." He wasn't afraid of her. He didn't even seem to flinch when she threw cruel words or slammed doors. Grace watched him closely, waiting for the mask to drop, waiting for him to leave like everyone else. But he never did. The days grew colder. Dry Creek felt tighter somehow, like the hills were closing in. Margaret became more bitter. She hated the looks townsfolk gave her now. Folks noticed Grace had new boots, secondhand but warm, and whispered that the cowboy had something to do with it. Micah never denied it, and Grace never asked how he managed it. She just wore them proudly. When Margaret spat at her, "Think them boots change who you are?" Grace simply looked away. Word spread quick in Dry Creek. Always did. It wasn't long before people started coming out with questions. Not to Margaret. No one talked to her if they didn't have to. But to Micah. The blacksmith asked if he needed work. The pastor asked if he was married. Miss Lillian, who ran the general store, once offered him coffee just to get a better look at him. Micah smiled politely and said little. He wasn't a man who filled silences with words. He filled them with presence. Grace met someone else too. A girl named Mabel who lived on the edge of town. Mabel's mother had passed the year before from consumption, and she'd taken to wandering the creek bed behind their property like she was looking for answers in the stones. Grace liked her because she didn't talk too much, and when she did, it wasn't fake kindness. She called things what they were. "You limp in, don't bother me," Mabel said the second time they met. "I got a crooked pinky." Look, Grace looked. It was crooked, all right, bent funny from some old break. They laughed about it. The friendship started easy. Simple. Grace had never had a friend before, but everything good seemed to carry tension under it, like the sky just before a storm. Margaret wasn't done trying to shove Grace into the mud. Her new way was quieter, spiteful. She'd pinch Grace's arm just above her sleeve line when no one was looking. Hiss in her ear, "He'll leave you too, you know," like a daddy did. Grace didn't believe her. Not all the way. But a small voice inside whispered, "What if she's right?" One afternoon, as Micah chopped wood near the porch, a man rode into the yard. His name was Silas Hunt. Rode a dark horse and had a smile so sharp it could slice skin. He was a trader, sometimes in goods, sometimes in rumors. Margaret greeted him too warmly for someone who hated company. Grace froze the moment she saw him. Something in the way his eyes lingered too long on her face, her legs, her limp. Silas looked Micah over like he was sizing him up. "Heard you've been playing savior, cowboy." Micah stood slow, set the axe aside. "Just help in where it's needed." "Help in someone else's property?" Silas drawled, glancing at Margaret. Grace's stomach turned. "Property?" Like she wasn't even standing there. "I ain't anyone's," Grace said suddenly, her voice small but firm. Silas's eyebrows lifted. "Well now, that's cute." Margaret narrowed her eyes. She didn't like Grace speaking up, especially in front of men. That evening, Silas stayed for supper. Grace stayed outside, sitting under the kitchen window, picking at her bandage. She didn't trust him. Micah stepped out later and found her in the dark. "You all right?" he asked, kneeling down beside her. She shook her head. "That man, he scares me." Micah didn't press, just sat beside her like he had the first time. Finally, he said, "You listen to your gut. Most times it's right." Grace nodded. He talked like I wasn't even real. "You're real to me." She looked at him. "Why do you care?" He rubbed the back of his neck. Didn't answer for a long time. Then finally said, "Because I see someone brave. Someone who's been through worse than most men I knew in the war. And you're still standing. That matters." His words sat heavy in her chest, warm and strange. She didn't know how to carry them, so she said nothing. Just looked at the moon and tried to believe they were true. Over the next weeks, Silas kept showing up. Sometimes to see Margaret. Sometimes to bring gifts, cider, scraps of meat, things they didn't ask for. Once, Grace caught him watching her from the barn door while she limped to the well. His eyes were calculating, cold. He said nothing, just tipped his hat and disappeared. Micah didn't like it either. "He's sniffing around for something," he told Grace once. "Men like that only give things when they want control later." "Do you think he'll hurt us?" she asked. Micah didn't answer, just tightened his jaw and checked his revolver that night before bed. That was the first night Grace locked the door to her small room upstairs. The next time Abel visited, she brought a ribbon. "For your hair," she said, grinning. "You always tuck it back like a grown woman. You're allowed to be a girl sometimes." Grace hesitated, then let her braid down and tied the ribbon on. Mabel smiled so wide it made Grace laugh again, this time not quietly. Margaret saw it from the window. That night, the ribbon disappeared. Grace didn't ask. She knew. And still, every day, Micah showed up. He built a small bench for her behind the barn where the sun hit warmest in the afternoon. He carved her a walking stick that was lighter, smoother, easier to use. He taught her how to hold it in a way that took pressure off her hip. "Why do you know all this?" she asked one day. He hesitated. "My sister had a foot that didn't work right after a wagon rolled over it when we were kids. I helped her walk again. Where is she now?" He looked away, buried up north. Grace didn't ask more. She knew the shape of that kind of grief. Some stories didn't need to be told to be understood. But every bit of light they found seemed to bring a deeper shadow. One morning, they found the bench had been hacked in half. That same afternoon, the new chicken coop door was kicked in. Silas came again the next day. He leaned against the fence, chewing a matchstick, smiling at Margaret like they shared a joke Grace couldn't hear. Micah walked out and didn't even pretend to be polite. "You need something?" Silas's smile curled, just admiring how things grow around here, especially unwanted things. Micah stepped closer. "Leave. You can't protect what don't belong to you." "I ain't protecting her," Micah said low. "I'm claiming her." Grace gasped. Silas's grin faded. "You heard me," Micah said, his voice sharp as flint. "She's under my care now. You so much as breathe wrong near her again, we're going to have a different kind of talk." The silence that followed was thick. The air itself seemed to pull taut. Silas mounted his horse and spat in the dirt. "You'll regret talking on someone else's burden." "She ain't a burden," Micah said. "She's the strongest damn thing I've ever seen." Grace stood frozen by the porch. Her heart thudded so loud she could barely hear anything else. No one had ever claimed her before. Not like that. And deep in her bones, for the first time, she felt it. She was wanted. Winter crept in slowly that year, with gray skies and wind that whistled through the cracks in the cabin walls. But inside, something was changing. Grace still woke each morning half expecting everything to fall apart, but the days kept proving her wrong. She'd open her eyes to find the walking stick Micah carved leaning steady by her bedside, her boots warming by the hearth where he'd placed them without a word. She was still under Margaret's roof, but the woman barely touched her now, only glared from the shadows like a dog whose bark no longer frightened anyone. Micah had built her a proper seat in the barn, this time nailed deep into the post so it couldn't be smashed. He called it her thinking spot. Grace went there often, sitting with a book, her feet tucked up under her and her eyes sometimes closed, just breathing in the hay, the horses, the world as it was, not perfect but not terrifying either. That bench was her proof things could be different. Her body still hurt, especially when the wind changed or the days grew damp, but it was bearable now. The pain didn't define her. One morning, Micah handed her a folded cloth. Inside was a simple leather glove, just one for her right hand, the one that got sore gripping her stick. "Saw you rubbing it yesterday," he said quietly, almost shy. "Figured this might help." Grace didn't answer for a second. Then finally she nodded. It's perfect." She wore it every day after that. When Mabel saw it, she whistled and teased, "Someone sure thinks about you a lot." Grace turned red. "He's just kind." But deep down, she couldn't stop thinking about how Micah watched her sometimes. Not like she was broken, not like he pitied her, but like she was something rare. Like she mattered. There were other small moments. Micah taught her to play cards, badly. She couldn't bluff worth a dime, but she tried anyway. They sat on the porch some evenings, playing until the sun dipped low behind the pines. Sometimes Mabel joined, and the three of them would laugh, especially when Micah pretended to be grumpy about losing. One cold afternoon, Mabel dragged Grace toward town, half limping, half laughing. "We're getting you a real dress," she declared. "Not that old gray thing. Something warm, something soft." Grace hesitated on the boardwalk. She wasn't used to walking through town without shrinking into herself. But people looked different now. They nodded at her. A few even smiled. Inside the general store, Miss Lillian gasped, "Well, look who's come to brighten up my shop. You've grown, Grace." Grace flushed. "No, ma'am, just standing straighter." They picked out a faded blue calico dress with tiny white flowers stitched along the collar. It wasn't fancy, but it fit. It made her feel like someone worth seeing. When Micah saw her in it, he stood still for a long second, his face unreadable. Then he said, "You look like the beginning of spring." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just smiled and looked away, heart pounding. The town slowly began to stitch her into its seams. The pastor offered her old hymnals. Miss Lillian gave her paper and a pencil and asked if she'd help with the store ledger sometimes. Even old Mr. Harris let her pet his dog when they passed by. But the peace wasn't untouched. Silas hadn't come around in weeks, but the memory of him lingered like a bad smell. Margaret got quieter, meaner. She stopped speaking to Grace entirely unless it was to mutter under her breath. More than once, Grace caught her staring out the window at the hills like she was waiting for something or someone. Then came a night of the snow. It was late, and Grace had just finished sweeping the porch. The snow had started gently, almost soft. Micah arrived soaked through, his hat dusted and white, his eyes sharp. "There's talk," he said without preamble, shaking off the snow. "Silas is coming back. Not just for a visit." Grace's stomach dropped. "What?" "He says you were promised." The words hit her like cold water. Promised? Margaret owes him. Debt or favor, I don't know. But he's saying things. Dangerous things. Grace backed into the corner of the porch, hands trembling. "She can't give me to him. I'm not hers to give." "I know," Micah said, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "But we need to be ready. If he comes here, if he tries anything, you don't open that door. Understand?" She nodded. "You'll be here." He looked at her, long and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." He stayed that night, sitting by the hearth with a rifle leaned across his lap. Grace lay awake in the loft above, listening to the fire crackle, feeling safer than she ever had, even though fear was curling at the edges. The next day, Micah saddled his horse and rode out to talk to the sheriff. The law in Dry Creek was loose. Sheriff Teller was old and tired, but he liked Micah. When he returned, Micah looked grim. He says unless Silas breaks the law in plain sight, there's nothing he can do. Claims it's not his business if two folks have a disagreement over an old deal. Grace clenched her fists. "So he gets to just take me?" Micah shook his head. "No, Grace. Not while I'm breathing." Later that week, Grace sat at her bench while Mabel braided her hair. They were quiet for a while, listening to the wind. Then Mabel asked, "Do you think he'll try it?" "Silas." Grace didn't answer right away. "He'll try. I can feel it." "Then we won't let him," Mabel said. "You've got people now, Grace. He can't scare all of us." That night, Micah brought her something wrapped in oilcloth. It was a pendant, a tiny metal charm with the shape of a bird carved into it. "Made this in another life," he said. "My sister used to wear one like it." Grace ran her thumb over the shape. "Is it for luck?" He nodded. "Or courage? Whichever you need more." She wore it under her dress from then on. Whenever the fear came creeping back in, she touched it and remembered she wasn't alone anymore. Margaret grew more bitter with each passing day, snapping at the air like a cornered animal. She slammed doors, cursed Micah under her breath, and burned dinner more than once. Grace avoided her when she could, but one night, Margaret cornered her near the kitchen door. Her breath reeked of cider. "You think you're better than me now, huh?" she hissed. Grace didn't move. "No, I just want to live." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret disrespect and blood." Grace stared back. "My father was the only family I ever had. You were never blood." She pushed past her then, heart hammering, legs trembling. Micah was outside chopping wood. She went to him, stood beside him without a word, and watched the snow start again. "She's slipping," Grace finally said. "I think she'll help Silas." "I know," Micah answered, "but I've got plans." The next few days were a blur of quiet preparation. Micah spoke to the blacksmith, borrowed tools, reinforced the barn door, fixed the hinges on the back window of Grace's room. He showed her how to use a flare gun, just in case. She hoped it would never come to that. Then the letter came, folded and crumpled, left on the porch. No name, but the handwriting was sharp. "I'll come for what's mine. You can't hide her forever." Grace read it once, then again. Then she lit a match and burned it in the stove. She didn't cry. Instead, she found Micah that evening, sat beside him at the edge of the pasture, and said, "I want to fight." He looked at her, searching her face. "You already are." But she shook her head. "I mean, really, I don't want to be hidden. If he comes, I want to stand there. Not alone, but not afraid either." Micah nodded slowly. "Then we'll stand together." The next day, Mabel arrived early with her brother, Thomas, a quiet boy with a hunting rifle and the same determined jaw as his sister. "We heard," he said simply, "and you're not facing it alone." The barn became their stronghold. They took turns keeping watch. Micah barely slept, but through it all, Grace felt something else growing. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was strength. She walked farther each day, leaning on her stick less and less. She read aloud from her hymnal. She helped Mabel make candles, taught herself to sew a button. She was becoming someone whole. And in the quiet spaces between the tension, there were moments that felt like peace, like promise. Micah once caught her staring at the fire and asked, "What are you thinking?" She looked up. That maybe this is what it's like to be loved. He didn't speak for a moment, then reached over and took her hand, rough and cold, but steady. "It is." The snow didn't let up for days. By the fourth morning, Grace couldn't see the fence line from her window. Everything was white, muted, buried, still. But inside, things churned. She tried to keep herself busy, folding blankets, stoking the fire, checking on the horses, but her mind wouldn't rest. Every creak of the wood made her flinch. Every shadow outside the window felt like Silas. Micah kept close. He barely left the cabin, sharpening tools or checking the traps near the woodshed. Grace could see it in his shoulders, how tense he was, how ready he had to be. But even with him near, a terrible fear took root deep inside her. She kept thinking, what if I'm not worth the fight? What if when the time comes, I freeze? One night, she dreamt she was back in Margaret's kitchen, sitting on the cold floor. Her legs were too weak to stand, and no one came. No Micah, no Mabel. Only Margaret, towering above her, holding that switch with a calm smile. Grace woke up shaking. She didn't tell Micah. She just curled further into her blanket and stared at the wall until dawn. Mabel noticed. "You've gone quiet," she said as they cleaned the lanterns. Grace shrugged. "I'm fine." "No, you're scared. That's not the same." Grace didn't answer. Later, she found herself outside in the snow, alone, her walking stick sinking with each step. She made her way to the bench Micah built and sat down. The cold bit through her coat, but she didn't move. Somewhere behind her, she heard the cabin door creak, but no one followed. She pressed her palms together and whispered, "Why me? What if he's right? What if I'm still the girl who got left behind?" That was the heart of it. Deep down, no matter how much warmth Micah showed her, or how many times Mabel stood beside her, part of Grace still believed she was disposable. That the world saw her limp, her pain, her silence, and deemed her less. That night, something changed. Margaret stumbled and drunk, her cheeks red, muttering under her breath. Grace froze by the hearth. Micah was outside, splitting wood. Before Grace could move, Margaret grabbed her wrist. "You brought this," Margaret hissed. "He wouldn't be coming back if you hadn't been born wrong. You ruined everything." Grace yanked her arm away. "You let him hurt me." Margaret swayed. "You think anyone cared? Your own mama died trying to birth you, and your daddy couldn't even look at you without seeing her dead. I raised you when no one else would." "You didn't raise me," Grace said, voice trembling. "You buried me in shame." Margaret lifted her hand, palm open. But this time, Grace didn't flinch. Micah stepped through the door. He didn't shout. He just looked at Margaret. "You lay a hand on her again, and I'll have you out in the snow faster than your mouth can open." Margaret didn't argue. She just muttered and stumbled off, slamming the door behind her. Grace sank down by the hearth. Micah knelt beside her. "You all right?" She nodded, but her eyes burned. "I want to leave this place, Micah. I want to run and never come back." He looked at her carefully. "Then we'll go." Her breath caught. "You go with me?" He took her hand. "I'd follow you anywhere. But we have to face this first. If we run now, he wins. And you'll carry that fear forever." Grace looked into the fire. She knew he was right, but it still felt like too much. The next few days were restless. Thomas came by with news. Silas was seen near North Ridge, only a few miles off. Grace felt the cold settle deeper in her bones. She tried to prepare. She practiced the flare gun, learned how to reload it, memorized the layout of the barn and where to run if she had to. But the fear wouldn't leave. And worse, her body was failing her again. Her leg ached constantly, sharp pain shooting from her hip down in her foot. She couldn't walk more than 10 minutes without needing to sit. It made her feel small again, helpless. One afternoon, she broke down. Mabel found her in the loft, curled up with her arms around her knees. "I can't do this," Grace whispered. "He's stronger. I'm still that girl who couldn't run." Mabel sat beside her. "Maybe you're that girl, but you're also the girl who stayed, who survived, who made it through all that hell and still stood up again." Grace shook her head. "But I'm tired." "Then lean on us," Mabel said. "That's what people do when they love each other. You don't have to carry it alone." That night, Micah brought her a pair of thick wool socks, hand-stitched with patches in the heel. "You won't be cold," he said. "Not on my watch." She put them on and didn't take them off for 3 days. Every time she felt like giving in, she rubbed her thumb along the seam and remembered someone had stayed. Still, the storm inside her didn't quiet. She started having dreams again, not about Margaret or Silas, but about her father. In one dream, he stood at the edge of the river, back turned. She called to him over and over, but he never looked. When she woke, the ache in her chest was worse than anything Silas had ever done. She tried to talk to Micah about it, but the words felt too big. So instead, she asked, "Do you believe people are born broken?" He looked up from his work. "No, but I think life can break him, and it's hard to stitch yourself back together." She nodded. "Some days I don't feel like I'm healing, just learning how to hide the cracks." Micah put his hand over hers. "The cracks are where the light gets in." The days dragged. The skies stayed gray. Then came the tracks. Thomas found them first, deep prints in the snow along the Easter Trail. He followed them until he saw the outline of a man on a hill, watching the cabin from a distance. Micah didn't wait. He rode into town, got the sheriff to post a warning, put out word that Silas was circling back. Grace sat by the fire that evening, arms wrapped around herself. "He's not going to stop." "No," Micah agreed. "He won't. I'm not ready." "Yes, you are." She turned to him, angry now. "How can you know that?" He didn't flinch. "Because I've seen what it takes to survive a life like yours." And you did. Every day you chose to keep going when no one gave you a reason to. That makes you the strongest person I know. Grace blinked fast. "Then why do I still feel like that broken girl on the floor?" "Because healing ain't loud," Micah said. "It doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just means standing up one more time than you fall." She said nothing. That night, she lit the candle beside her bed and prayed. Not to be rescued, but for courage. The next morning, the cabin was silent. Margaret was gone. Micah found a note scrawled in her hand. "You want her so bad. She's yours. I'll be far away by morning." Grace stared at the note. Something inside her twisted. Not sadness, not relief. Just emptiness. Like something had been torn out and underscore. Tossed to the snow. She left, Grace said, voice hollow. Micah touched her shoulder. "She was never yours to lose." Grace said nothing, but her hand found the pendant at her neck. She gripped it tight. Then she stood. No cane, no help. She stood on her own, because Margaret might have walked out and Silas might be coming. But Grace had decided she wouldn't be the one to run. Not this time. Not ever again. The wind had shifted. Grace felt it in the trees before Micah even said a word. It was the way the sparrows quieted, the air turned heavier, how the sky pressed low like it knew something was coming. That evening, she couldn't eat. Mabel tried, brought her stew and fresh bread, but Grace just sat by the window, staring out at the thinning woods, waiting. Micah had posted signs, spread word to neighbors, set up a warning bell on the porch. But they both knew if Silas wanted to come, he would. It was never about sneaking in. It was about control, fear, power. The kind he used to strip her of everything. Her trust, her voice, her very body. Grace was shivering, though the fire was warm. Mabel handed her a blanket. "He doesn't get to win." Grace didn't look away from the window. What if he already has? What if I've just been living in the pieces he left behind? Mabel knelt beside her. "Then tonight, You take them back." The sun sank lower. Thomas came by one last time, rifle over his shoulder, horse tied out front. "He's near. Just got word from the Monroe place. Man matching his description was headed west. On foot. You've got hours, maybe less." Micah nodded grimly. "Thank you." Thomas looked at Grace. "You want me to stay?" She stood slowly, her limp more noticeable in the cold. "No," she said. "If he comes for me, I want him to see me." Thomas hesitated, then tipped his hat. "You're braver than most men I know." After he left, Grace went to her room and shut the door. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out the old wooden box Micah had made her. Inside were letters she never sent, drawings from when she was small, and a single faded photograph of her mother. Grace stared at her mother's face. Young, soft-eyed, tired, maybe, but kind. "I'm sorry I wasn't more like you," Grace whispered, "but I'm going to make you proud." She dressed slowly, wore her best wool skirt, the one Mabel had mended for her birthday, and a plain white blouse. She braided her hair, tying the end with a blue ribbon. Then she strapped the flare pistol Micah gave her to her thigh and stepped outside. The sky was ink. No stars, just the wind moving fast through the pines, whispering secrets only the mountains knew. Micah stood on the porch, waiting. He didn't ask where she was going. He just fell in his step beside her as she made her way toward the barn. "We'll stay close," he said quietly. "If anything happens," she stopped him with a look. "He took enough of my life. I won't let him take this too." Micah swallowed and gave a small nod. "Then I'm here. However you need me." They stood in silence, watching the trees. The first sound came slow, crunching snow. Then the outline of a man, broad-shouldered, heavy steps, wearing the same dark coat she remembered from years ago. Silas stepped from the tree line, eyes locked on her like he'd known all along she'd be waiting. "Well now," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Ain't this something?" Micah didn't move. Grace stepped forward, her hands steady at her sides. "You came all this way," she said. "For what?" "To finish what you started." Silas grinned. "You think you got away. You didn't. A broken thing's still broken, no matter how long it's been hid in a pretty box." Her hands curled into fists. "I'm not broken anymore. I survived you. That makes me whole." He laughed. "You always were a mouthy little cripple. Guess that's why nobody else wanted you." Micah started forward, but Grace raised a hand. "No," she said. "Let me." She stepped towards Silas, breath even. "You beat a child because she was smaller than you. You touched her because she couldn't stop you. That doesn't make you powerful. That makes you a coward." Silas's face twisted. "You don't talk to me like that. I talk to you however I want. You don't own me." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm. But Grace didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She reached for the flare pistol and fired. The flash lit the sky in red. It was loud, sharp, and sudden. Silas stumbled back, blinded. Micah had his rifle up in seconds. But Grace didn't need saving. Not anymore. Silas dropped to his knees, covering his face, cursing. From behind, hooves thundered in. Neighbors, riders, a full circle of men and women who'd come at the signal. They surrounded him, weapons drawn. "You're done," Micah said flatly. Sheriff Monroe arrived minutes later. Took Silas in chains, barely said a word to Grace. Just tipped his hat with quiet respect. After the crowd thinned, Grace sat on the porch steps, trembling. Her hands shook, her knees felt weak, but inside, something new had taken root. She wasn't afraid. She looked up at Micah, who was watching her, still tense. "I didn't think I could do it," she whispered. "You did more than that," he said softly. "You faced him." She exhaled hard, and something left her body, something heavy and buried and dark. She looked at her hands and imagined all the things they could now hold. Peace, safety, maybe even love. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat outside, wrapped in a quilt, listening to the stillness. Mabel joined her near dawn, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "You did it," Mabel said quietly. Grace sipped. "I still feel hollow, like I spent everything I had in me." "That's grief," Mabel said. but the kind that clears room for something better. Grace looked toward the horizon. The mountains were pink with morning. I don't know who I am now. Mabel smiled. Then it's time to find out. The next week passed in small steps. Grace helped Micah with the roof. She sat at the sewing table with Mabel, even started journaling in the quiet hours before bed. Her limp didn't vanish, and the old pain still visited her on cold days. But she stood straighter now, spoke louder, even laughed more. One afternoon, she passed a mirror and stopped. She looked older, not her face, but in her eyes. Wiser, weathered, but not beaten. Later, she took the photo of her mother and placed it on the mantel. Then she added something new, a small carving Micah had made, shaped like a bird mid-flight. Because that's what she felt like now. Not fixed, but free. And sometimes that was even better. Spring came quiet, like it didn't want to startle anyone still nursing winter wounds. The snow melted slow, revealing earth that had waited patiently under the cold. The cabin smelled different now. Fresher, softer, like cut wood and sun-warmed herbs. Grace noticed everything. The way Micah's boots sounded on the porch. How Mabel hummed while watering the garden. The stillness no longer felt like fear. It felt like peace. They didn't speak much of Silas after the arrest. Sheriff Monroe kept his promise. Silas was gone, locked up awaiting trial in the next county. Grace didn't ask for updates. She didn't need them. The past had already been put to rest, not with chains, but with her voice. Some mornings, she still woke up expecting shadows, but they passed quicker now. Instead of panic, she felt her fingers brush against the ribbon in her braid or the soft knit of the quilt Mabel had sewn for her, and it reminded her she had made it. Not just through Silas, but through all the quiet ways people had tried to erase her. She helped Micah plant beans one afternoon, sitting on the edge of the row with her sleeves rolled. Her leg ached, but she stayed with him, handing tools and laughing when he smudged dirt on his own face and didn't notice. He wiped his brow and leaned back beside her. "You know," he said, not looking at her, "I used to think love had to be loud. Big gestures. Fireworks." Grace brushed a clump of earth from her knee. "And now I think it's quiet. Comes slow, but when it settles, it doesn't leave." She looked at him, and he finally looked back. "I'm not good with pretty words," he added, "but I'd give you the roof over my head. My hands. My name, if you wanted it." Grace didn't speak right away. Her heart thudded in her chest. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of something real. Something gentle. Something earned. "You already gave me everything that matters," she said softly. That evening, she lit a lantern and sat with him on the porch steps. The stars were beginning to come out, and the air smelled faintly of pine and ash. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and he didn't move, just placed his hand on hers, warm and steady. "I've been thinking," she whispered. "I don't want to run from this land anymore. I want to make something here. A home that doesn't carry his shadow." Micah nodded. "Then we will." Over the next few days, they cleared the back lot, replanted the broken fence, and drew out plans for a new lean-to. Grace helped where she could. Mabel brought fresh cornbread and seed packets. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And every post they hammered into the ground, every row they sowed, felt like a promise to the future. One night, a soft rain fell over the cabin. Grace lay beside Micah, the windows open to the cool air. The roof creaked gently in the breeze, but inside it was warm. She turned to him, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. "Does it scare you?" she asked. "How quiet it is now." He smiled faintly. "No, quiet means no one's running anymore." Grace curled into him. "Then I think I'll stay." In the morning, the world felt new again. Not perfect, but hers.